Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a video that I did last year, which was inspired by a tweet when I did it last year, and I'll put a link to that video in the description box down below. I want to talk about some books that I read in 2021 that for various reasons I wish more people would discover and read and talk about. Maybe they either never generated buzz in the first place or they did generate some buzz when they were released and that died down over time, and I am here to try to pick that back up and get more people to discover them and read them and enjoy them, hopefully as much as I did when I read them this year. So let's dive right in with the first one, which is the final revival of Opal and Nev by Dawnie Walton. This is a really interesting book to me. It was one of my most anticipated reads of 2021, and I'll put a link to that video in the description box down below if you'd like to check that one out. I'm going to do a follow-up video where I talk a little bit about how I did on reading my most anticipated reads of 2021, but that's going to be a whole separate thing. For now, I just want to focus on this one and say that it really lived up to that expectation. It drew me in because it is told in oral history format, which is something I am fascinated by. I enjoyed when Daisy Jones and the Six used that format in its book, but I listened to that one on audio. This one I read in print. What I really like about this one is that all of the characters have very different voices. Like, you really get a sense that they are different people. And it's interesting how in many books, even when the perspective shifts from person to person, the style doesn't really change. But here, each person really does have a sort of unique voice, and I really deeply appreciated that. The premise is that in the early 1970s, there was Nev. It was this sort of folk British pop act, and his label couldn't really get him to take off. So they had this idea to pair him with someone who was sort of his contrast. So after a search, they found Opal, who was a sort of jazzy gospel singer from Michigan, I believe. It's been a while since I read this book. And they came together and produced one album, and in a concert to try to promote that album and make it take off, there was a riot which resulted in the death of the drummer. Now, all of these years later, Nev went on to have a really great career. Opal's career kind of flamed out after that. And now a woman who works for a music magazine is doing an oral history about the band and that riot and what happened afterwards. She has a very specific interest in this because her father was the drummer who was killed in the riot, and he had been having an affair with Opal. So that sounds really complicated, and it gets pulled off really well. Ultimately, there's a little bit of a change about halfway through where once you discover certain things about what happened that night and the characters, it becomes a much more personal mission for the character who is sort of putting together all of this oral history in the book. And what it ultimately is about is who gets to tell history, who gets to tell the version of a story that is accepted in media, and how media is culpable in framing that, and how we accept what is told to us by the media as true when there could be a lot more going on, and the people who we vilify for certain things. It's not necessarily done fairly or for any good reason. And what can happen when we give some people a pass and just make other people held accountable far beyond what it is worth. I think it's a very interesting book. I really enjoyed it a lot. I know I've had a conversation with at least one person who follows along my videos about this book, but otherwise it just doesn't seem like it's really gotten any traction this year. And I really hope that more people will discover it because I loved it. It lived up to that expectation. I don't think it's a perfect book by any means, but I really enjoyed it. And I particularly liked the conversation that it has about fame and history and representation and why representation matters. So I would recommend this book. I'm going to recommend all of these books, but let me just say it for this one in particular. I definitely recommend picking this one up. The next one I want to talk about was another one of my most anticipated reads of 2021. It's The Bad Muslim Discount by Syed M. Masood. This book is really funny, it's really dramatic, and it is very enlightening. One of the things I love fiction to do is put me inside the heads of other characters who have had very different experiences of the world, and this really does that. I'm blanking on the names of the two characters. So there's Anvar and Safwa. Anvar is from Pakistan, Karachi, and Safwa is from Baghdad. They both have very different paths to the United States. Anvar and his family immigrate when he is a teenager. Safwa gets here as an illegal immigrant with her father and her husband, and it's about the very different experiences that they have. Ultimately, of course, they end up meeting, but I think one of the smart things about this book is I kind of expected them to meet and for there to be a romance that blossoms between them, and that's kind of true here. But what ends up happening is so much more complicated than that. And I really deeply appreciated this book and the really complicated characters that it has. Anvar is sort of this golden boy who's really sarcastic and doesn't take things too seriously. And over the course of the book, he learns to be a better person in a way, and to listen to other people and take them seriously and to do good things in the world and not just be in his own head. And Safwa is really beaten down by religion and her society, and even at the same time, she loves where she comes from and her family, but she doesn't feel able to express her individuality. She does not feel able to make choices for herself in the way that Anvar takes for granted. And because of that, they are really interesting characters to play against each other. And I really enjoyed their experience of the world. It starts in the 90s and kind of moves into more recent times. Anvar seems to be something of a stand-in for Syed M. Masood, who immigrated from Pakistan when he was a teenager and has lived here since. And Anvar is toying with the idea of becoming a lawyer, and Syed M. Masood became a lawyer. So it is interesting as well because Syed M. Masood seems to really understand Anvar. Since he is a sort of a stand-in for Anvar, or Anvar is a sort of stand-in for him, he needs to understand Safwa better. And the whole point of the book is about that coming around to her point of view. And I thought that was really interesting and well done. So this is another book that I really hope more people will discover. I listened to it on audio and I just love it. It will be popping up in my favorite reads of 2021. Spoiler alert for that, because I think it's just great. Really, really great. And I hope if you pick it up that you will love it anywhere near as much as I did. The next book I want to talk about had a big spike of attention that was paid to it when it was on the shortlist for the National Book Award. It's Zorrie by Laird Hunt. And it seems like things have gotten pretty quiet about this book since the National Book Awards. It ultimately did not win. It lost to Hell of a Book by Jason Mott, which I have not read yet. But I think this is just a really beautiful, short book, and a very powerful book despite how short it is and how it seems to gloss over things, and yet everything is really deeply meaningful. And it's beautifully written. I had read one book by Laird Hunt before, which is called In the House in the Dark of the Woods, which flirts with horror or thriller conventions. But this one is very different. The premise of the book pretty much happens in the first 20 pages. You have Zorrie, whose parents have died, and she is placed in the care of her aunt, but then her aunt dies when she is roughly 18. So she sets out in Depression-era United States, ends up working at a factory where she uses radium to paint numbers on clock faces so they will glow in the dark. But of course, because she is handling radium, it gets all over her, and she and the other girls who work in the factory glow at night. That is what the premise of this book is if you see it listed online anywhere, but that happens within the first 20 pages, and then it kind of moves on from there. She ultimately goes back to the county where she grew up, and it's about the passage of time, and it's about how life can sort of get away from you, and you end up not doing a lot of the things that you might think you want to do or aspire to, but about how beautiful life can be anyway. It is one of those novels that really revels in everyday life and makes everyday life beautiful and meaningful and profound. And it'll be interesting to see if this book pops up in the conversation for, say, the Pulitzer Prize. We'll have to wait and see what happens with that until roughly April of 2022, assuming that they go back to April to announce the prize in this year. They've been doing it later in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. But I do hope that this is a book that does not get lost in the shuffle for a lot of people, because it is just beautiful and I loved it a great deal. The next one that I want to talk about had a really good burst of buzz when it was released in January or February of 2021, and then really died down a lot. It's The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. This is also going to be one of my favorite reads of the year. And when I read it, there were a couple of people who commented on videos and did not enjoy it anywhere near as much as I did. But I've also had conversations with people who really loved it just as much as me. This is a book that reminds me of Toni Morrison. And I don't think it's a perfect book. It has little flaws, but it is fascinating and heartbreaking, because it is about two gay men who are enslaved and living on a plantation back during the buildup to the Civil War, I believe. If I remember correctly, it's before the Civil War. And it's about how the other people on the plantation didn't necessarily mind that they were sort of living as a couple until another enslaved person, in order to gain favor with the man who owns and runs the plantation, becomes a sort of preacher. And he sort of calls attention to what they are doing and how they are living, and calls it wrong. And this is sort of paralleled with the ways in which white people came to Africa, took people from the lives that they have known, the heritage that they have had, and brought them over and enforced their own rules on them. And in ways these seemed arbitrary. And these rules against homosexuality are part of that. So you don't necessarily know that something is wrong until somebody else comes and tells you that it's wrong, but it's not actually wrong. And nevertheless, it becomes enforced. And I thought that was really interesting, and the way in which Robert Jones Jr. used that stories of ancestry to reflect that, I thought was really profound and beautiful. And I really appreciated the fact that each chapter shifts around to a different perspective of someone who is living on the plantation or an ancestor. And I really thought that created a chorus of voices that enriches the story, because they are all different. They all reveal something different, and they all have different ways of thinking and looking at what is going on around them. Some of them are complicit in helping the system that they are living in. Some of them are just going along to get along, and some of them are actively trying to find ways to rebel. And some of them are doing quiet rebellions, like the two men at the center of it. They aren't necessarily out to start a fight. They just want to live with each other and be happy. But even among themselves, they fight, because one of them is more likely not to argue or talk back, and the other one is really angry about the way they are treated as enslaved people. It's a really complicated book, and I thought it was beautiful. I think the comparison to Toni Morrison holds up. Robert Jones Jr. has also said that James Baldwin is a big influence of his. I see more Toni Morrison, but I do see James Baldwin here as well, and I think he is worthy of those comparisons. The next one I want to talk about is something I had started earlier in the year and abandoned because it was stressing me out with the mental state that I was in. It's Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson. I'm now getting back to it and trying to finish it on audio. I'm almost done, but I'm already going to put it here because I think this is a really good book. It can be difficult if you have triggers like dogs dying or anything like that. There are a lot of environmental ramifications for what is going on in this book. And part of that is that there are stillborn babies who are born with birth defects, and other fallouts from the chemicals that have been used. And if that is a trigger for you, beware, because I was really going through like a stressful, anxious period, and it didn't play well with me while I was going through that. But it is a really well done story. Ash Davidson actually grew up in the sort of environment where this is set. It is set, I believe, in 1977 in California, where in a logging family. And Ash Davidson grew up in that. She has really deep empathy for the people who work in these situations, and both sides of it. There are environmental people who are coming in and trying to talk about the environmental impacts of logging, and Ash Davidson certainly sympathizes with them because the whole book is about the environmental devastation that has happened because of this. But she also really sympathizes with the people who depend on logging and who are being taken advantage of by the companies that employ them, and in many cases with their lives or just horrible injury. And she really understands both sides of the argument, and I think that is very well done and well reflected. And this book has a sense of grief around it, which again, if you're in a difficult mental spot, which aren't we all right now, it can be difficult to get through. But it's also a beautiful book, very well told, lots of empathy in it, and it really does capture a point in time that was critical, because a lot of people had depended on logging, but things were changing really quickly. And she, in an interview I saw, she mentioned that she very specifically chose this time period because by 1978 or 1979, environmental regulations had already been put into effect that would make the logging industry that these people depend on drastically different, and they don't know what that is. And there's a family at the center of this who are living with secrets and living with varying levels of acceptance and rebellion against the logging company and the ways in which it is using these pesticides that are potentially harming them. Even the idea of investigating whether or not these pesticides or chemicals that they are using are harmful is really fraught, because if you question the logging company, you could lose your job. Other people will censure you, and perhaps violently. And it's a really interesting book. It can be difficult, but I would definitely recommend it if you can stomach it. I'm glad I got back to it, and I'm finishing it here at the end of the year. The next one I want to talk about, I wasn't so sure I was enjoying as I was reading. It's Chouette by Claire Oshetsky. I think it's difficult to read a book about how difficult parenting is and can be when you are in a difficult stage with your own parenting. My foster son was kind of in the process of moving out. It was a very difficult moving out process. So it was kind of deliberately poking a bruise for me. But the more I think about this book, the more I appreciate what it does. And it's definitely something that I am continuing to think about. Chelsea from the Montana Book Company says that this is her favorite read of 2021, and I can absolutely see why. And I do hope that more people pick it up, because it's a book that you want to talk to other people about, but you can only talk to other people about it if they have read it. So please, let's have more people pick up this book so we can all talk about it and what it means. It is about how difficult parenting it is. It is about how you give everything of yourself to your children, and then ultimately they leave, and what that process is like. But it's also a very coded reference to raising a queer child in a world, and how the ways in which the system or the status quo will be forced on them, and you might have to compromise, and they might have to compromise, and how difficult it is to be an individual who stands out, because it is about it's sort of an allegory for all of those things, because it is about a woman who has a baby who is half human and half owl, and she wants to celebrate all of its owl instincts and let it be an owl if it is an owl. But society is uncomfortable with who her child is, and they want it to be different. And of course, I think there's room to make an argument for sort of a middle ground, but I think the point is actually well done, because if you have a queer child, you don't necessarily want to tell them that they need to conform to other people just to make them more comfortable. And I did appreciate that. The next one I want to talk about is another book I'm actually in the process of finishing. It's Work Like Any Other by Virginia Reeves. And I'm not done with this book yet, but I'm getting close. And it's weird to say that this book could be overlooked. This is the only one that was not published this year, by the way. It was longlisted for the 2016 Booker Prize. It ultimately did not make the shortlist, and it lost to, I believe, The Sellout by Paul Beatty. But that was really the year that the Booker Prize came into my consciousness, and I fully admit it was because an American author won. But it feels like this book has really faded from the spotlight since then, and I hope more people will discover it, because it's really beautiful and smartly done. It is the story of Roscoe T. Martin, who in the early 1900s steals electricity from the government to put electricity on his farm. Ultimately, someone from the power company discovers what he has done and is accidentally electrocuted, and Roscoe goes to jail. And it is about his life, it's about what happens to his family. There is a black man who worked on the farm who helped him steal the electricity, who ends up in a work camp. And so there's even a really interesting racial element to the book where it talks about the different standards that existed and continue to exist. And it's really beautiful, and it's really thoughtful and empathetic. There is really deep understanding of all the different characters and what they feel and what they are going through and what they want and how that might conflict with other people and other characters. And there are very interesting perspective shifts. And it feels like a lesser author would have really focused in on Roscoe and would have focused in on a specific plot point. So there's a warden in the prison who wants him to work with him and the search dogs who would go out and find any prisoner who escapes. And it feels like a lesser book would have really focused in on that, but that's just one facet of a much larger, multi-layered story that keeps fanning out as you go through. And it's just really well done. There's even a part where Roscoe gets stabbed by another inmate. That's not a spoiler. It happens relatively early or toward the middle of the book. But point just being, as he recovers, he is sort of hallucinating and he's in this sort of dreamlike state. And the way Virginia Reeves writes that is just stunning, I think. So this is definitely something that I hope more people will discover and pick up. And then I just want to end with a bit of a shout out to a sort of bonus book on this because I know a lot of people are watching the movie of The Power of the Dog, and I'm kind of hoping that people will pick up the book because I loved it. And I will put my video with a comparison of the book and the movie in the description box down below as well. There are spoilers though, so you might want to bookmark it or add it to your watch later list if you want to watch the movie or read the book first. That's your warning. But I do hope that more people will read the book. And it feels weird. That's why it's a bonus book, and I'm not going to include it in the video proper because I think a lot of people are talking about The Power of the Dog right now. But I hope people do head on to the book either after they've watched the movie or before. So those are the books I read this year that I hope more people discover. If you have thoughts on any of these, please let me know in the comment section down below. And if you have other books that you have read during the year, I would love it if you are a booktuber and you do this video. I would love it if you don't have a channel and you let me know what books you hope people discover in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.